Hello everyone, and welcome to Chapter 13 on Social Psychology. So as I've mentioned a couple times now, this is one of the areas that I studied a lot in. My master's is actually in applied social psychology, so it's an area that I find particularly fascinating, and hopefully you will find it interesting as well. So social psychology studies essentially the effects of groups on the individual. So when we see events in history like the death of almost a million Tutsi people at the hands of the Hutu tribe, or the killing of millions of Jewish people by Nazis during World War II, we might ask questions such as, is a person who partakes in these types of atrocities necessarily a monster? And how can we explain this side of human nature? So when terrible things do occur, we tend to look for bad people to blame, and we generally fail to question the larger system. So Dr. Philip Zimbardo, who we'll actually talk about a little later on in this chapter, he's a highly influential social psychologist, and he said it's not the bad apples, but the bad barrels. So it's not the people themselves, it's essentially kind of the people who are giving them the orders. So things like lack of supervision, physical and mental exhaustion, and social norms, condoning prejudice towards outgroups, can all influence whether or not people behave in ways that we would consider to be kind of negative or antisocial. So it can be disturbing to fully consider the situational explanation for evil. This basically says that, if it's the situation, if it's the people around them that are influencing them to act in these ways, that we could also fall prey to these influences. So we would also have the capacity to do terrible things if we fall into the wrong circumstances. That's a very scary concept to think of. But we need to keep in mind that situational analysis is never enough. It is never just the situation. Individuals also retain a sense of free will as well. So in order to try and fully understand social reality, social psychologists study the interaction between the person and the situation. So, for example, Kurt Lewin, who's kind of known as the grandfather of social psychology, he expressed this insight as a mathematical formula where he said B equals F and then brackets P and E. So behavior is a function of both the person and the environment. And this insight challenged claims made by both Freudian theories, which are basically blaming everything on the unconscious, and behaviorism, which would blame everything on the environment. So Module 13.1 is going to review the power of the situation. So we'll talk a bit about social influences on our behavior. So social norms are defined as the usually unwritten guidelines for how to behave in social context. So norms can be enshrined in law, so something like we do not kill other people, unspoken cultural understandings, you don't get up and start screaming at the top of your lungs if you're on a crowded bus, or tiny unspoken regulations. So just kind of the ways in which we interact with people and what's considered socially acceptable behavior. So norms govern much of our behavior, even though we often fail to realize how strong of an impact they can have. And although we are often unaware of it, we also tend to engage in mimicry, which is basically taking on for ourselves the behaviors, emotional displays, and facial expressions of other people. So for example, there's something called the chameleon effect, which basically describes how people mimic others non-consciously by automatically copying others' behaviors even without realizing they're doing it. And this kind of very subtle mimicry is highly functional. It can serve as what we call a social glue to help coordinate behaviors in social settings, and it can help kind of reassure and validate the people around you. So the social benefits of mimicry can be seen in how they affect social interactions we have. People tend to mimic others more often when they are trying to make a good impression. So if you're mimicking someone, it actually can help to increase their liking of you. Unless they notice that you're copying them, and then that could be a whole other story. But then kind of on the opposite side of that, we have ostracism, which is being ignored or excluded from social contact, and it's another very powerful form of social pressure. So a lot of the times people would engage in mimicry and things like that to try to prevent that ostracism from occurring, because we actually know that being socially isolated can actually be as painful as kind of physical pain. It can activate some of the same areas in the brain as physical pain. So in contrast to social norms, which I was talking about are kind of those unwritten, unspoken rules of the society or the group that you're a part of, we also have social roles. So these are more specific sets of expectations for how someone in a specific position should behave. So you could have a social role of professor, student, coach, parent, or even prison guard. And I mentioned that one because it's going to be very relevant to the next example. So roles emerge within a specific position in society, and the rest of society expects the person to behave in accordance with their role. So in 1971, a social psychologist by the name of Philip Zimbardo, who's the person we mentioned back on that very first slide, wanted to study the impact that situations could have on people. So he wanted to know, would good people do bad things if you place them in a bad situation? So he devised what is now known as the Stanford Prison Study. So essentially this study consisted of Zimbardo and his colleague Craig Harvey, and they wanted to know what would happen if ordinary students were assigned to play the roles of prisoners or guards. So they set up a prison in the basement of a Stanford University building, which is why it's called the Stanford Prison Study, and participants agreed to live there for 2 weeks. So basically what they did is they took a bunch of college students. They were all physically and mentally healthy. They did a bunch of like wellness checks and things beforehand, and then they divided them randomly into the role of either prisoner or guard. And what ended up happening is, even though they planned the study to go for 2 weeks, most of the prisoners quickly became distressed and helpless, as they exhibited both emotional symptoms and physical ailments as well. And we saw that some of the people who were assigned to be guards, they tried to be nice and fair. They attempted to be, kind of benevolent, but others, around a third of them, became harsh, and they doled out frequent punishment, even when no wrongdoing had occurred. So some of them, a select few, actually became kind of almost sadistic in the way that they were punishing and almost torturing the prisoners. And keep in mind, these guards and prisoners were arbitrary social roles that were assigned to these students. So before this, they were all, on an even playing field. But just by assigning them those roles, it really seemed to dramatically impact the behavior that occurred. And what ended up happening is that the study had to be ended after only 6 days instead of the planned 2 weeks. So they actually couldn't even continue the study because it was causing so much psychological and even physical, in some cases, distress in some of the participants. So the researchers concluded that this was a very powerful demonstration of how roles affect behavior. So the people who were assigned to be guards, they were wearing the uniform, they were having the power, and it seemed to really influence their actions. Because keep in mind, these were all normal students who were deemed psychologically and physically healthy beforehand. So it wasn't like they just picked, a group of sadistic individuals and assigned them to be prison guards. It actually seemed like the role shaped their behavior. What was it? They kind of tried to play into what they thought was expected of them. And so it was actually shown later on, when they talked about it, that Zimbardo himself also fell into his role of prison superintendent. So he was supposed to be kind of the warden of the prison, I guess. And so excerpts from some of his briefings with the guards included things like, we'll take away their individuality, it'll lead to a sense of powerlessness, we'll have all the power and they'll have none. So it seemed that even Zimbardo kind of got swept up in that role as kind of the warden or the superintendent of this prison. So overall, the study provides yet another powerful illustration of how the social situation can affect behavior. And unfortunately, at this stage, I would always show a video. There's a lot of videos that I like to show for the social psych stuff, but unfortunately I can't in this context. So I've got the link in there, and the link will be in the PowerPoint file as well. So if you want to click on the link from there and pause this video for a bit, I'd like you to watch the video, just because it shows some really interesting clips from this study. So now we'll talk a bit more about other types of group dynamics, so concepts known as social loafing and social facilitation. So a question I might ask, and again, I know it's kind of rhetorical at this point because there's no one around to answer me, but do you like group assignments? And typically when I ask this question in class, some people do, some people don't. Quite a few people don't. And so even though the purpose of group projects is to produce better work than working alone, this is often not the case, which may be why a lot of people don't really like group projects. And you might ask, why is this? Why, if there's more people to work on it, would there be less productivity? So basically what happens in some cases is that groups can produce poorer outcomes due to what we call social loafing. So if you're a part of a group and you see that everyone else is putting the effort in, you might actually put less effort in because you feel like it won't be noticed. So social loafing is literally when somebody's just kind of coasting along and not really contributing and letting everyone else in the group do the work for them. Social loafing can occur in all types of tasks, so physical activities, cognitive activities, and creativity, as well as across all types of groups. And one reason why people might social loaf is that they believe other group members are also not doing their best, which kind of sets up a social norm of, well, people in this group don't work very hard. So if you think, hey, well, you know, my partner doesn't really seem to be doing much for this, so therefore, you know, why would I do much for it? That just means that I'm putting in more effort than they are, and that's not fair. There are two likely outcomes of social loafing. So basically, either one person social loafs and then people notice it and nobody really kind of puts the effort in and you end up with poor group performance, or a small number of people end up saving the group. So I don't know about you guys, but if I'm in a group, I tend to take on that role. You know, if there are other people who aren't doing the work, instead of nagging them about it, I tend to just take it over and get things done, which is not a great thing to do, because basically you're letting people get away with that social loafing in that case. But a lot of the time, unfortunately, we will have at least one or two group members who do take over and do the work, even if other people are kind of slacking off. And so that kind of reinforces the social loafing for the person who's doing it, because they're still not doing work and they're still getting a good grade. So it's important for us, in order to try to combat social loafing, to understand what factors might encourage it. So a few of the factors that can contribute to social loafing are believing that one's own contributions are not important to the group. So basically thinking, well, you know, I've got nothing that matters to say anyway, so why even bother? Low efficacy beliefs, so thinking the task is too complex and it's something that, you know, I can't actually do anyway, so if I can't figure it out, then I'm just not even going to try. The third is not caring about the group's outcome. So, I mean, depending on if this is a group for a class and it's an important project worth 50%, or if it's a group for kind of an optional study group and it's not really worth any marks, like that's going to probably make a difference in terms of social loafing. If somebody feels that the outcome is really important, then they're obviously probably going to be less likely to engage in social loafing. And the fourth and final is feeling like others are not trying very hard. So this is what we were kind of talking about earlier, when one person social loafs, if another person realizes that, then they might say, well, they're not putting effort in, therefore I'm not going to. And that can kind of lead, unfortunately, the whole group to go downhill. So in contrast to social loafing, we have another phenomenon called social facilitation. And so this occurs when one person's performance is affected by the presence of others in a more positive way. So for example, cyclists tend to ride faster when they're racing against each other. Even if they're practicing and they're trying to go really fast in their practice, they're probably always going to go faster when there are actually other people around and they've got that kind of pressure of competition. But it is important to note that the presence of others doesn't always improve our performance. It is likely to actually interfere with our performance when our skills are poor or if the task is too difficult. So if it's something that we're good at and we do well and we know we do well, we tend to actually improve when there are people watching us. If it's something we're still not sure about, we're not really great at, or it's really difficult for us, then we actually might do worse if people are watching us. So there are several different mechanisms that have been proposed to explain social facilitation. For example, the presence of others tends to be emotionally arousing. So it can kind of, you know, if you've got a higher level of arousal, there are times when that'll help us kind of perform better. So arousal tends to strengthen our dominant responses. So again, that kind of explains why if it's something you're already good at, then that level of arousal will make you better at it. Whereas if it's something that you're not really sure about or it's a bit complex, that arousal might actually hinder your performance. So now I want to talk a bit about the concept of conformity. And conformity is another one of those major concepts when it comes to social psychology. So basically, when people are part of a group, they often tend to conform to the group by behaving in ways or exhibiting attitudes that are expressed by other group members, so kind of going along with the group. And this can result from either real or imagined group pressures. So it might not necessarily be that, you know, the group is saying like you have to think this way, but sometimes, you know, a person in a group will think, well, this is what my group thinks and I'm a part of this group, therefore I need to think the way they do. So it's either a real or an imagined group pressure. So in the 1950s, a researcher named Solomon Asch provided a very famous experiment, a very famous example of the powers of conformity. So he conducted a study in which the participant was asked to look at a test line and tell which of the three other lines it matched in length. And I'll show you a diagram from this in a minute. But basically you have three lines of different lengths and they're labeled A, B, and C, and then you're given one line and you say, which one does this closest, which does it match? Which one is it the same length as, A, B, or C? So what would happen though is that they had 8 participants, and the first 7 participants weren't actually participants at all. They were confederates of the experimenter. So they were actually in on the experiment. And they all deliberately picked the incorrect answer. So just consider that for a minute. If you were sitting in a classroom and I showed you 3 lines and I showed you a test line, I said, which one does this correspond to? and you thought it was B, and then there are 7 people ahead of you and they all say A, one by one. What do you think would happen when it got to your turn to speak? Do you think you'd still stay confident and you'd say the answer that you really thought, or do you think you'd kind of go along with the group? So basically that's what Ash was testing here. He wanted to see if this would affect the answer of the real participant who had to choose between his own perception, so what he kind of knew to be true or what he saw to be true, and the word of the 7 others before him. So the results illustrated that 75% of participants, so 3/4 of the participants, gave the wrong answer on at least one of the 12 trials, and 1/3 of participants conformed more than half of the time. So it seems like that kind of desire to fit in with the group or to gain information from the group can be really, really powerful. And you can see here in figure 13.1 what I was talking about like the standard and comparison lines. So for example, if you're looking at that, you can see that B is clearly the right answer in this case, but all of the other people before the real participant would say either A or C, and then kind of see how the participant responded. So participants later reported that during the task they were feeling uncertain or confused, and they actually often apologized when they disagreed with the others during testing. So even if they did stick to their guns and say, I'm pretty sure it's B, they would actually say, I'm sorry, like, I know you guys all picked A. Like, they really felt like they kind of had to make up for it or justify it in some way. So a question we might ask is, what would make participants go against their better judgment and side with the majority? So there are 2 basic motives that have been identified for conformity. The first is the need for social acceptance. So basically, even if I don't agree, I'm going to go along with things to fit in. So in this case, this normative influence is the result of social pressures. The person still knows that they're correct in their initial judgment, but they go along with the group perspective in order to be accepted rather than rejected. Because as we mentioned before, when we talked about ostracism, being rejected or being excluded from social groups can be very, very detrimental, both kind of emotionally and physically at times. The second potential reason that they would have conformed is the need for information. So if everyone else is doing it, then it must be the best or smartest thing to do. So this would be an example of what we call the informational influence. So they feel like even though they judged B as the correct line, if 7 other people all said it was A, well, maybe those people are onto something. Maybe they see something I don't. So they actually start to kind of second guess their own judgment and think, well, I might as well go along with the group. They probably know better. There's so many of them. And I like to give the example of the old show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. I don't know if any of you guys remember that because it was a while ago. I don't think it's still on anymore. But one of the lifelines that they had was to ask the audience, right? And so basically they would ask the audience what they thought the answer to the question was, and almost always they would go along with whatever the majority was, right? So that would be an example of that informational influence. They assume that the majority of people pick this answer, then it's probably the right answer. In that case, they weren't sure themselves, so it makes more sense they go along with the informational influence. But you can see how it would affect participants even in Ash's test. If 7 people are saying that it's all one line and you think it's the other, well, maybe you do start to doubt yourself and your abilities. And I have another YouTube video here that I would like you to watch. It's my favorite example of conformity. It's not anything to do with Ash's experiment, but I'll let you check it out. Hopefully you get a chance to watch it. Like I said, I really love watching these videos in class for this chapter. So I hope you're able to access them on YouTube and watch them as you go along. So in Ash's study, both types of influence seem to be occurring. So some said afterwards they thought they had misunderstood something, so they were using that informational influence, basically saying that, maybe the other participants have more information than I do, while others noted that they didn't want to stand out or make a scene. So they were falling prey to more that kind of social influence and trying to go along with the group and fit in. But there were some personal and situational factors that contributed to conformity. So we did see that people tended to be less likely to conform when there was only one other person in the vicinity, there are only male group members, there are only strangers in the room, there are extremely clear and simple tasks, there is one other non-conformist in the room, so if one other person agrees or kind of goes against the others, then it makes the actual participant much more likely to kind of also go with their gut. And if the responses are made anonymously. So if it's anonymous and they can't tell who answered what answer, then it would make more sense that they would be less likely to conform in that case. They tend to be more likely to conform when there's a larger group in the vicinity. So the magic number, it seems to be around 3. If you have at least 3 people who are all kind of going with a certain direction or going with a certain answer, then that seems to really increase the likelihood for conformity. Any less than 3, and conformity kind of drops dramatically. There's a high proportion of female group members. There are friends, family, or acquaintances in the vicinity. The task is unclear or ambiguous, so if it's harder to actually figure out what the answer is, then it makes sense that you'd be more likely to conform. If others conform first, so you've got, all 7 of them are all saying the same thing, and if the responses are made publicly. So you've got that pressure. If you're making the response publicly, you know that they're going to know you were the one who went against the group. So therefore, you're going to be more likely to conform in those cases as well. So some follow-up experiments to the ASH study found 2 additional aspects of conformity. There's a really fascinating relationship between conformity rates and the size of the group, and I kind of mentioned this, so very low conformity if only 1 or 2 people gave the wrong answer, but it did seem like 3 was kind of the magic number for conformity. Above that, conformity didn't increase very much more if it was like 3 or above, but it did decrease dramatically if there was only 1 or 2 people. And also, even though groups are powerful, individuals can also be very powerful. So even a single dissenting voice, and again, this was kind of mentioned in that diagram, was enough to shatter the group's power. So having 1 other person who kind of disagreed was enough to kind of break that pressure to conform. So it's important for people to realize how much power they wield as individuals. In many cases where terrible things occur, there are very strong normative pressures which present a strong risk of groupthink. And groupthink is something that we're going to talk about in a moment. Here we go. So groupthink refers to the stifling of diversity that occurs when individuals are not able to express their true perspectives. So essentially, if they are in a group and they are trying to avoid arguments and kind of strive for agreement and maintain group harmony, and also, as an individual, they don't want to be evaluated negatively, they'll be much more likely to kind of not speak up if they have different opinions or different ideas. They're more likely to kind of stifle that diversity in order to maintain that group harmony. So when group members are more concerned with avoiding disagreements than with generating ideas, there are 3 main problems that can occur. The group members may minimize or ignore potential problems or risks of ideas because, they don't want to be the one that points out that maybe something will go wrong with this idea. The groups tend to be likely to settle too quickly on ideas due to social pressures. So they're just basically trying to make the decision and get out of there, and they just want to, keep everyone happy. So they're probably going to jump to a decision really quickly and not really consider, again, some of the potential risks or alternatives. And then groups often become overconfident and therefore less likely to carefully examine consequences of their decisions. So they tend to actually be less likely to learn from their mistakes because they feel like, if they have the power of the group behind them and there's nobody who's speaking up against them, then they're much more confident that they're actually right. So some symptoms of groupthink include an illusion of invulnerability, so thinking that, the group can do no wrong and that nothing can harm them. Self-censorship, so people who are part of the group tend to censor themselves. If they have ideas that go against the group, they basically just keep them to themselves. They don't speak up. If there is any dissent, so if somebody does speak up, there's a pressure on dissenters to conform. So basically if one person says, I don't know about this, maybe this is not a great idea, the other ones kind of all pressure them, oh no, it's fine, like don't worry about it, like let's just all, go along. Let's just all get along and get this over with. And finally, an illusion of unanimity. And this basically comes from the self-censorship and the pressure on dissenters to conform. So it seems like the decision being made is unanimous because there's no one speaking up against it because 1, they're either censoring themselves, or 2, they tried to speak up and somebody pressured them to basically shut up and just listen. So groupthink can unfortunately lead to really disastrous consequences at times in both military and civilian life. So for example, the Challenger launch, essentially what happened there is they had tons of scientists and people who were kind of all working on the shuttle and getting it ready to launch. And there were a few people who thought that it might not be a good idea and it wasn't quite ready yet. But of course, due to groupthink, they were kind of quickly silenced and not really listened to. And unfortunately, the shuttle did end up exploding after launch and killing people. So it was a pretty disastrous consequence. The Bay of Pigs invasion is another one it talks about in your textbook a little bit. But fortunately, there are ways for us to minimize groupthink if group leaders reward doubt or dissent. So basically when somebody speaks up and they're not sure, they actually encourage that and kind of praise them for it. If they protect or encourage minority views. If they ask for alternative solutions, so this is a big one, you know, if you're not just going with the first thing and you're saying, hey, can we think of any other ideas? And if they are willing to explore risks. So now we're going to move on to talk about obedience for a little bit. And this is another of the major experiments in social psychology that kind of make it what it is today. So far we've had Zimbardo's prison study, and we've had Asch's line test for conformity, and then kind of the third and the trifecta of really important classic social psychology experiments would be Milgram's shock experiment. So in the early 1960s, Stanley Milgram designed a study that is now known as one of the most famous social psychological studies of all time. Essentially, he wanted to know whether people would obey authority when it conflicted with their own ethical standards. So even if they were told to do something that normally they wouldn't do, they would think is wrong, would they do it if it was kind of ordered by an authority figure? So participants were recruited for what they thought was a study on the effects of punishment on learning, and they were all assigned seemingly randomly to the role of teacher. So basically in each phase there was a teacher and a learner, and whoever the person was who was the actual participant, they were always assigned to the role of teacher, and the volunteer who was given the role of learner was always a confederate of the experimenter. So they were always in on the experiment. So there were actually no learners, and that's important to keep in mind. So basically the learner, aka the person who's in on the experiment, was placed in an adjoining room, and the teacher was asked to shock the learner every time they made a mistake while reciting word pairs. So basically they were giving them a bunch of word pairs together, and then they were testing them on their knowledge for remembering those word pairs. And every time they got one wrong or they didn't answer, they got a shock. The shock was to be increased by 15 volts for each error made, and the labels on the machine indicated that the shocks ranged from slight up to danger, severe shock, and even XXX, which looks really negative, right? So it's important to note, again, that all these learners were volunteers, they were in on the experiment, and nobody was actually being shocked. Because I tell this story every year, I talk about this in detail, I even show some videos from the experiment, and still every single year I have at least 3 or 4 people who on their exam will write that the learners were actually shocked. And they're not. There was nobody actually getting harmed, except for the psychological harm done to the participants. So before the study began, Milgram asked many professionals how far they believed the teachers would go. So they asked, people like psychiatrists, psychologists, how far do you think the average person will go in terms of believing, when they believe they're shocking this person to the point that, at some point the learner actually stops responding and it's kind of assumed that they might be dead. And so psychiatrists predicted that most would refuse to go beyond 150 volts, so the first 10 shocks, and that only 1 in 1,000 would go all the way to the end. And so that would be, the psychiatrists were basing this on the base rate of sadistic or psychopathic individuals in the population. So they were like, only someone who's like a true psychopath or a sadist would actually go to that final level of voltage. So how far do you think the participants in this study actually went? Think, any of them went all the way? Maybe none did? If you think some went all the way, how many do you think went all the way? And I'm asking you these questions because I think you're going to be really surprised by the results of this study. So it was found that 2/3 obeyed to the very end. So every single person gave at least some amount of shock, and 2/3 of the participants went all the way to the shock that was literally labeled XXX, as in like death. Even when the learners protested, sometimes they would yell, oh, my heart, like they would say they were having heart problems, they would scream, they would cry, they would ask to be let out of the experiment. At some point they would stop responding, and it was assumed by the teacher that the learner had maybe even died, and still 2/3 of these teachers went all the way to that highest level of shock. So there seemed to be no gender differences or occupational differences among obedience, no ethnic differences, and the results have remained the same or similar for over 3,000 people during various replications of this study. So we can't do this type of research anymore. These studies by Milgram and Zimbardo and things like that, they were actually some of the first that really got us talking about ethics in terms of our participants in research in psychology. But basically, back when this study was first done, it was replicated multiple times, soon after, and we saw these results across cultures, ethnicities, genders, occupations. Even when the learner was screaming in agony, stating they had a heart condition or stopped responding, like I was talking about, it did not change the likelihood of compliance. The critical point seemed to come at the first time that the learner tried to withdraw the consent. So around 150 volts, the learner first tried to say, stop, let me out of here, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And so that was kind of the point at which more subjects disobeyed the experimenter than any other. So if they were going to quit, chances are they would do it around that point. But those who went past the 150 tended to go all the way then. They were kind of invested in it at that point. And again, I have another YouTube video for you here, which I'd really like you to watch. It's just kind of some actual footage from the study. So you can see that even though there was nobody being physically harmed in terms of actually shocking people, the emotional turmoil that was basically created in the participant who thought that they were severely hurting and maybe even killing someone was enough to basically make it so this experiment could never be ethically reproduced again. So here's just a bit of some of the pictures kind of from the experiments. So you can see that was the machine with the shocks on it. They've got the learner getting strapped in. So the teacher was able to see the learner get strapped into the shock machine, so it looked really realistic for them. Then we had the experimenter explaining to the teacher what the experimental procedure entailed. And, although most subjects were highly obedient, again, 2/3 went all the way, some, such as this person, refused to continue. So there were some people who kind of gave up, but overall, the obedience rates were shockingly high. So despite the high rates of compliance that we did see in Milgram's original experiment, as well as many replications, there were some conditions that decreased the rate of obedience. So these are important to keep in mind because they were really kind of helpful in terms of allowing people to kind of break out of that mold and not obey in this certain circumstance. So if the experimenter was not in the room with them, they are much more likely to disobey. If the learner was in the same room, so the person they were allegedly shocking was in the same room as them, they were much less likely to obey because, that person's physically there so they can kind of see the damage they're doing, even though no real shocks are being given. When two experimenters issued conflicting demands, and so that's an important thing to note, that basically in the original experiment, the experimenter would stand there kind of in their white lab coats, and they would never say you have to continue, that you have no choice, but they would say things like, the experiment must continue, like we must go on, like it's important that like we keep going type thing. So they never forced anyone's hand, but they were pretty kind of insistent that you should continue with the experiment. But if there were two experimenters and one said keep going and the other one said stop, people were much more likely to disobey. When the person giving orders was an ordinary man, so that when they weren't the experimenter dressed up in the lab coat and looking very official, if they were just kind of a plainclothes person from off the streets, people were less likely to obey. And when the teacher worked with peers who refused to continue. So if there were, say, two teachers, and they were both supposed to be shocking this learner, or maybe they were shocking two different learners, and one of the teachers decided they weren't going to do it anymore, then the other one was much more likely to disobey as well. Because as we mentioned with conformity, back when we were talking about Ash's line test, if there was even one person who didn't conform, that makes it a lot easier for the next person to not conform, right? So that kind of extends to here. So if there was another teacher who refused to continue, the original teacher was also more likely to refuse to continue. And so this appears to show us that obedience is a function of the situation, not the person. So it wasn't so much to do with those people, whether or not they were good or bad people to begin with. It had a lot to do with the situation and those social pressures that were being placed on the individual in this situation. So there was one final repetition of the Milgram experiment done that examined something known as the banality of evil. So banality is basically meaning something that's kind of unoriginal or unremarkable. And basically what it's referring to is that often much of the individual behavior that allows for great harm to be perpetrated is carried out by ordinary people. So it doesn't have to be like an evil, sadistic person to behave in a way that might be considered bad or evil. And so this final iteration of the experiment, teachers only had to read the word pairs while another person delivered the shock. And that actually led to an even further increase in obeying. So 92.5% of people obeyed to the very end. So it kind of shows you how they can, if they're in a situation where they can put the responsibility or put the blame on someone else, it can be very easy to kind of continue with that type of really terrible role, as long as there's someone else to blame it on. And it's similar to something called diffusion of responsibility, which is something that we'll talk about very shortly. So these experiments were widely considered unethical because they led to emotional turmoil and distress in the teacher. So like we said, they weren't actually harming the learners, but they were harming the teachers psychologically. And so we cannot do any type of experiment like this these days. But overall, Milgram's study has had a great impact on public awareness surrounding the dangers of uncritical obedience. But social psychologists would generally agree in the final analysis that people are responsible for their behavior. So even though situational factors are really, really powerful, we can resist them and make a free choice, which is shown by the fact that even in the original iteration, you still had, 1/3 who weren't obeying till the end. And even in this final iteration, you still had 7.5 people who didn't obey, 7.5% of people who didn't obey to the bitter end. So there is still the capacity for free will, even if the situation seems very overwhelming. So now we're going to talk about something called the bystander effect, and this is actually kind of a really sad story. So if you came across someone who was injured and desperately seeking help, would you stop and assist them? Most people would like to say yes, because we consider ourselves good people, and we consider ourselves people who would do what's right in the situation. But one of the most powerful examinations of the ways that social situations influence us has been the study of helping behavior. So although we would all like to believe that we would help when needed, the truth is often, sadly, quite different. Such is the case of Kitty Genovese. And this is a really sad story about a young nurse from New York City. And so this happened in 1964. Essentially, she was coming home from work late at night, and she had taken the subway, and so she was walking from the subway station to her apartment, which wasn't very far away. And on the way, she was attacked by a man. And she was screaming for help, of course, and so a bunch of people in her apartment building, she was just outside her building, kind of threw the windows open and lights came on. It was late at night, so people were waking up and kind of peering out the window, and the guy got scared and ran away. But then after a few minutes, when there were no sirens or anything, he came back and attacked her again. And I think at that point he was again scared away for a brief period of time, but he ended up coming back and attacking her a final time in the hallway of her apartment building, and unfortunately she was sexually assaulted and killed. She was stabbed to death by this man. So this murder launched an important line of research which found similar effects in many different situations. And so basically what happened in Kitty's situation was that despite the fact that there were a ton of people in her building, I think it was like 30 something people had heard her scream and opened their windows, reported, having witnessed this, but nobody actually did anything. Nobody called the cops until after the point where she was already killed. She had already been murdered. And so basically what this shows us is that the bystander effect, or what we also kind of refer to as bystander apathy at times, proposes that an individual is less likely to help when they perceive that others are not helping, or if they perceive that there are enough people around that they don't feel personally responsible to have to help. They would assume that somebody else has helped. And so in this case, what probably happened is, even though there were so many people watching and they heard her screaming and they were opening the windows and yelling out the window, nobody really bothered to call the police because everyone probably assumed that somebody else had already done it. And so very sad situation, but we bring it up because it really kind of highlights the importance of this bystander effect and how it can be really detrimental in emergency situations. So one explanation, and I kind of just mentioned this, explanation offered for the bystander effect is that the more people who are around when an incident occurs, the more likely each individual person is to think that someone else will help. So this is known as the diffusion of responsibility, which I kind of talked about back with Milgram's study in that final iteration. So when somebody else was actually doing the button pressing, and the teacher only had to test the person on their word pairs, they were much more likely to continue because the responsibility wasn't solely on them at that point. So the responsibility was diffused in a way. And basically, that's what a lot of researchers would point to as explaining this bystander effect as well. So diffusion of responsibility refers to the reduced personal responsibility that a person feels when more people are present in a situation. So if one person witnesses an emergency, obviously 100% of the responsibility is on that person to call the police or to help. But if 10 people witness the emergency, then you basically only got about 10% of the responsibility for each person. So therefore, they're a lot less likely to actually jump in and help in that situation. So that would be what we consider the diffusion of responsibility, and it is one of the main factors that is often implicated in that bystander effect. So now we'll talk about something a little bit more positive. So far we've focused mostly on the pressures of conformity and ignorance and how they may cause people to behave in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. But there are also many examples in which people have disobeyed orders they consider to be wrong or have gone against prevailing beliefs. So unfortunately, the cost of this dissent, the cost of kind of thinking for yourself and going for what you believe is right, can often be very high. Most groups do not welcome dissent. You know, we talked about groupthink and how basically dissenters are pressured to conform. They also tend to not welcome deviance and nonconformity. And a half to 2/3 of whistleblowers, so people who have kind of, reported a wrongdoing or something in the company or the organization they work at, they actually end up losing their jobs, and some may even lose their homes and families. So unfortunately, it can actually cost someone to do the right thing in a lot of cases. So if the cost may be high, what might cause someone to go against the group and express a minority viewpoint? So we'll talk about a few factors that can contribute to altruism. So nonconformity and altruism. And altruism is defined as selfless or dangerous action on behalf of others, helping others in need without receiving or expecting reward. These two types of behaviors have a great deal to do with personal convictions and conscience, but just like conformity, they are also subject to certain situational pressures as well. So the first is you're much more likely to behave altruistically if there's a perceived need for intervention or help. So it's kind of clear that the person really does need your assistance. If cultural norms encourage action, so there are definitely certain cultures that are more altruistic. And, to give a very basic example, do you think if someone, fell down on the street in, say, small town Manitoba versus someone fell down on the street in New York City, where do you think someone's going to be more likely to kind of stop and help? And the answer is probably going to be small town Manitoba or any small town in Canada, really, because we're kind of known for having that cultural norm of being kind of friendly, helping people. So I would say that on the whole, and I mean this is not to make, broad assumptions, but on the whole, our culture tends to be a bit more altruistic than other countries might be. The third is that there is an ally. So we think of Ash's experiments. Participants were much more likely to disagree or go against the experimenter when they had an ally. So if you have someone else who says, well, I'll step up and help you too, you're going to be more likely to step in and help. And the fourth is when entrapment occurs. And entrapment is something that we'll kind of touch on in the next couple modules. I don't think we actually even define it still in this textbook. But basically what it means is that if you start to take a few steps towards a certain direction, a certain decision, you're much more likely to become entrapped and you kind of continue on with that course of action. So if somebody asked you to kind of help them out with a small assignment, and then next time they asked you to help them out with, say, writing a paper, and then next time they kind of asked you to help them create like practice tests and stuff, like they could be asking for more and more, but after a certain point, you tend to feel that since you've already engaged in the first actions, you might as well continue with that course of action, and it can kind of lead to you doing bigger and bigger things. So we'll talk about something called the foot in the door phenomenon in, I think, the last module that kind of covers that concept as well. And that is it for Module 1. Hopefully you've enjoyed it so far. Make sure to watch those videos if you haven't done so already, and I will talk to you in Module 2.